Thank you very much, Stephanie. It's just wonderful to be back in Little Rock. So much of what I'm going to talk about today really had its roots, its beginnings here. I've been coming down here for a long time, more than a quarter of a century. Long before there was a Clinton presidency, a Clinton library, a Clinton school, when we were all dreaming that someday that would happen. Bruce Lindsay has been my friend, believe it or not, for over 45 years. And Bruce, in the late 1980s, connected Bill Clinton with the Democratic Leadership Council, and the rest, well, you all are living it right now. So it's so terrific to be here. Thanks to Stephanie, to Skip, to Nikolai, and to Joy, who put this program together. It's just great to see so many friends. I'm not going to try to mention all of them, but one person that I wanted to mention was a high school, one of my best friends in high school, and wound up teaching at the University of Arkansas. Little Rock is taught here at the Clinton School, and is in here, Dave Sink in the back. Governor Tucker, welcome. Bob Nash. I told Nash he used to run my patronage program at the White House. It's nothing like having the head of White House personnel making sure that all of your people are well served in the administration. I also want to just mention somebody who's not here, who to me represents the best of anybody I've ever known, and that is Mac McLarty. I told Stephanie this morning, Mac called me this morning and said he was sorry he couldn't be here. Mac has followed me and come to my events all over the country. If it's possible for Mac to be there, he has been, and he has been such a loyal friend. I just wanted to mention him here. On election night, 1980, I threw a party and nobody came. By the time the party was to start that night, it was clear the Democrats had lost the White House, were well on their way to losing the Senate, and to losing dozens of seats in the House. I was working in the White House, so I had lost my job, and most of those who invited to the party had lost theirs too. There was no reason to celebrate, and you all know how bad the 1980 landslide was, because an important governor lost his reelection bid that year, and it was time for a new beginning of the Democratic Party. Fast forward to June of 2000. In Berlin, leaders of center-left countries, center-left governments from 14 countries, led by Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, signed a new progressive declaration that articulated their common approach to governing. The themes, which will be familiar to all of you at the Clinton School, were opportunity, responsibility, and community. President Clinton was completing 2 successful terms as president, and his new Democrat philosophy was modernizing progressive politics all over the globe. My book, The New Democrats and the Return to Power, is the story of the New Democrat political movement, the movement that led the Democratic Party from the political wilderness to political power, and in doing so, I believe, saved the Democratic Party and progressive government from going the way of the Whigs. I wanted to talk today not only about what we did, I'll talk a little bit about that, but you can read the book and get that in much more detail, but also about the lessons that both parties can learn from us today. The New Democrat movement was grounded in the core principles of opportunity and responsibility, America's basic bargain and the core of my personal political philosophy. I came to understand the power of that bargain working in my first job for President Kennedy's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, in the War on Poverty. I happened to be assigned to the Deep South by Shriver, but my area ended at the Mississippi line, so I didn't get over to Arkansas in those days. But I witnessed firsthand the enormity of the changes brought about when people in some of the poorest counties in America were empowered, politically empowered by the Voting Rights Act, and economically empowered by the War on Poverty. And they took advantage of the opportunities they were given. I just want to tell very briefly the story of two people, because people sometimes forget what a great country this is and how much we've changed, even though we're still not perfect, how much we've changed over the last 50 years. I met my wife in Wilcox County, Alabama, working for the War on Poverty in 1967. She was down there working for the SCLC in a program funded by the War on Poverty. We were introduced by Reverend Tom Threadgill, one of Martin Luther King's lieutenants in that part of Alabama. But while she was down there was an old African-American sharecropper named Jesse Brooks, who was sort of her guardian. And I remember Mr. Brooks taking us around in his pickup truck that was so old you could look down through the floorboards and see the cement. When the SCLC went into Wilcox County in 1965, not one African American was registered to vote. Think about that. President Obama could not have been registered to vote. But then we had the Voting Rights Act, we had the War on Poverty down there. 4 years later, after we were married, Mr. Brooks came up to visit us in Bethesda, Maryland, suburban Washington. He had taken advantage of his opportunity. He had been elected tax collector of Wilcox County. The other person, and Bob Nash, you may know this person, who we actually met on the last night, one of the last nights of Bill Clinton's chairmanship of the DLC, was Jesse Banks in Mississippi. In 1968, Sergeant Shriver sent me down to Holmes County, Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta, to report to him on a work-study program. And what I found were the young black kids were getting their work experience building segregation academies for the White Citizens Council. Fast forward again to 1991, Mike Espy and I were launching the Mississippi chapter of the DLC. I told that story as just an example of how far that district had come, with Mike now being their congressman. At the end of my speech, a woman came up to me who I'd never met. Her name was Jessie Banks. She said, "My name's Jessie Banks. I'm mayor of Chula, Mississippi in Holmes County, and that family that built the Chevrolet, or that ran the Chevrolet dealership and built the segregation academy has been run out of the county." I've never forgotten what I learned during those 3 years in the War on Poverty. That belief in opportunity and responsibility, which was at the core of President Clinton's philosophy, was, to me personally, the cornerstone of my philosophy. And it became the cornerstone of the New Democrat philosophy. I wrote my book in part because political memories are short. Democrats control the White House now and have a demographic advantage in presidential elections. But a quarter of a century ago, and many of you were involved in this, that situation was entirely reversed. In the 3 presidential elections in the 1980s, the Democratic candidates won a smaller percentage of electoral votes than any party's candidates had ever won in 3 consecutive presidential elections since the advent of modern American parties in 1828. The Democratic Party was out of power, out of touch, and out of ideas. The New Democrats were insurgents in our own party. Our vehicle was the Democratic Leadership Council, which, as Stephanie told you, was created in 1985 after our second 49-state loss in just 4 elections. As President Clinton wrote in the foreword to my book, When we began, we weren't very popular. Party leaders tried to shut us down, but we were determined. You all have seen the Clinton determination here many times. You can read about what we did in the book, but when I want to, and I can't tell the whole story in a few minutes, but I do want to cover some of the highlights. Very important, and some of us were talking about this earlier this morning. The New Democrat movement was an idea movement. That was the second reason I wrote my book. I believe that ideas are underappreciated in today's politics. But we believed that the intellectual resurgence of our party had to precede its political resurgence. And if we stood for things the American people supported, voters would return us to national power. So our strategy was to shape a political message and a governing agenda that could carry a Democrat to the White House, then find a candidate who could run and get elected on that agenda and then govern on it while in office. Our goal, and this is very important, was not to accommodate or to be acceptable to party leaders. It was to win. And we knew that some of our friends would fall off the reservation along the way. But we saw that as a necessary price to pay. Our challenge was not to unify our party, but to expand it. If you think about where the Democratic Party was back in those days, unifying the party meant sure defeat, because there just weren't enough people willing to vote Democratic in presidential elections. So every time people in our party said, you know, you guys are trying to divide the party, I took it as a badge of honor, because our challenge wasn't to bring a losing coalition together, it was to expand it into a winning coalition. Because we could not prevail in regular party forums, we set out to create a new playing field, one where we had home field advantage. We nurtured a new generation of Democratic leaders. We developed ideas that challenged party orthodoxy. We organized our own forums and conferences around the country. Many of you attended a lot of those. And we really gained momentum. What really set us off was the 1988 landslide loss. Governor Dukakis's loss. Most Democrats thought we were going to win that election. And any of you who were at Atlanta at the convention will remember we walked out of Atlanta with a 17-point lead. And yet, by the time the campaign was over, it was an election that was not very different than 1980 or 1984. We lost over 40 states. And that gave us momentum. You know, sometimes you say things that can turn out to be really stupid, and sometimes you say things that can be prescient. In 1988, Governor Dukakis really wasn't the DLC candidate, but he was a Democrat, so we were supporting him. And so when I was asked going into the convention what I thought about the Dukakis candidacy, I said, he's erased the graffiti from the wall. He wasn't just an old interest group politician like Walter Mondale, bound to lose, but he hadn't painted the mural. And as we remember, meaning that he hadn't really laid out an agenda of his own. He was just running his, you remember, competence, not ideology. So what happened in the campaign was President George H.W. Bush painted the mural. He defined Dukakis as the way he wanted to define him and not the way Dukakis would have liked to have been defined. So after that landslide loss, we had our mission for the next cycle. It was to paint the mural. At 4 o'clock one afternoon in April of 1988, Bruce Lindsay picked me up at the airport and drove me down to the Capitol, where I met with then Governor Bill Clinton and offered him the chairmanship of the DLC. After a little bit of chit-chat, I said to him, you know, if you become chairman of the DLC, we'll pay for your travel around the country. We'll put together an agenda that I hope we can win on the White House, win the White House with in 4 years. and you're going to be president someday, and we'll both be important. And he said, okay, I'll do it. So we went on a four-part strategy. The first part was not very endearing to the rest of our party. I call it reality therapy. You know, after you've been beaten 3 times in a row, even after you've been beaten 3 times in a row by landslide losses, a lot of people say, you know, oh, they had Reagan, he was a great candidate. You know, if we just got our message across a little bit better, we'd be okay. We didn't need better television ads. The caucus wasn't a very exciting candidate. But reality therapy told us that if we didn't fundamentally change and re-energize and renew the Democratic Party, that we're going to lose again. And we laid it out. The reason people weren't voting for us, and this didn't make party leaders happy, was very simply they didn't trust us to grow the economy and create opportunity. They didn't think we would defend our country. And they thought we were hostile to their mainstream values. Well, why do they elect presidents? They weren't going to elect us until we changed that. So we went around, we did a big study called The Politics of Evasion, Democrats in the Presidency, did a whole bunch of things like that. But essentially, we went around and laid the political predicate for changing the party. The second part was, and some of you were there, was at New Orleans in 1990. Clinton's first meeting as chairman, he actually assumed the chairmanship in New Orleans. We issued what we called the New Orleans Declaration. It was a very simple 15-sentence statement of what we believed in. A lot of people looked at the New Orleans Declaration and said, well, doesn't everybody believe in it? And I said, yes, a lot of people do, but most people don't think Democrats do. And it was simple things like the mission of the Democratic Party is equal opportunity, not more government. You know, economic growth is the cornerstone or the prerequisite to opportunity for all. We believe in the politics of inclusion. We believe in a strong defense. We believe in preventing crime and punishing criminals. We expected people to give something back to the country. That philosophy really was the basis of a lot of the Clinton presidency. And in the speech where Clinton exaggerated a little bit about me at Hyde Park, he basically did that whole speech on how the New Orleans Declaration was the platform and the framework for his administration, and every idea that he pushed and that defined him in the presidency had its roots in that philosophy. Now, there are very few presidents who could do that. But to be honest with you, I think it's one of the most important things he ever did, and it was really the reason for the strength and the success of his presidency. Then the third part was to add an agenda to that philosophy. And for about a year, Clinton and I and others traveled the country. Clinton and I think, were together in 25 states. Can you imagine that? It was before Air Force One. And at the book party in New York, he thanked me for putting him in all those unsafe airplanes. But we had some white-knuckle flights. One time we were flying from Denver to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and it was a blizzard. And they told us not to fly, but we had a lunch, and Stephanie and Skip will identify with this, Nash might too, in Cheyenne that was being sponsored and hosted by Governor Mike Sullivan and Secretary of State Kathy Carpin. Well, you know, Wyoming had an early caucus, and a very important one for Clinton, and it was held in Kathy Carpin's basement. So we weren't about to miss that event. So we get up there, and I knew we were in trouble when Clinton started calling everybody he knew because those, what we thought were clouds turned out to be snow-covered mountains. But somehow we made it. We also had some interesting experiences. We were in North Carolina one day. We flew into Raleigh. We had been in Kentucky, and Mayor Jerry Abramson of Louisville had told us the University of Kentucky was playing at Chapel Hill that night, and we were flying into Raleigh about a half hour before the game. So Clinton says to me, let's go to the game. And so we got tickets. State police met us at the airport, escorted our entourage, a little smaller in those days. It was just a state police car and one other car, to the Dean Dome. We got out. They told us to park our car right next to the Dean Dome, and we went on in and watched the game. We came out, and the campus police had towed our car. I think they were probably embarrassed 2 years later when he was president-elect of the United States. But through all that, we finally arrived at an event that some of you had come to. I don't think Carol Willis is here, but Carol organized busloads of Arkansans to come up to our convention in Cleveland, where we actually laid out that agenda. Clinton gave what in his book he called the best speech of his life. We put 3 words into the political lexicon that have dominated progressive politics ever since: opportunity, responsibility, and community. And ideas, we offered ideas like national service. It was so great. I saw Stephanie last week when she announced the presidential leadership scholars. But then on Friday, I was at the White House for the 20th anniversary of AmeriCorps, all because of, that was our idea that we put on that we had pushed for a long time, but really put in the spotlight in Cleveland. The welfare reform, support for trade agreements like NAFTA, community policing, the earned income tax credit, which was the largest, we never get credit for this, the largest anti-poverty program in the history of the country, moved more people out of poverty than any other single act. Charter schools, reinventing government, and most important, an economic growth strategy based on fiscal discipline, investment in people and technology, and expanded trade that brought America a decade of prosperity that we could only wish for again. Then but in our system of government, there's only one way you can tell whether any of this matters, because nobody pays any attention to party platforms, and that is you've got to market test it. And the market test is in the primaries. We did a little pre-market testing in the summer of 1991. We went to Chicago and visited public. But the interesting thing about the pre-market test, everything we did, and this is so emblematic of what turned out to be the Clinton presidency, everything we did was about ideas. We didn't go out and organize, we didn't go out and raise money. We went to Chicago and walked through the public housing projects where Vince Lane, then you remember him, the director of the Chicago Housing Authority, had been the first person to go actually do police sweeps, get the thugs and everybody who was not on a lease out of those buildings, clean them up, put the tenants in charge. It's one of the most remarkable experiences I've ever had. We went to New York and walked the streets in Brooklyn with some people who were redeveloping the community. We went to West Hollywood, California, and walked the streets with community police officers. You talk about an idea that changed America. Community policing, which we learned on one of our trips from Reuben Greenberg, the African-American Jewish police chief of Charleston, South Carolina, who decided that all this 911 rapid response effort on crime wasn't reducing crime. And so Reuben Greenberg said, I'm going to put police officers back on the street. That turned out to be the genesis of 100,000 cops. And what it did was it allowed police officers, we could sell it to the left in our party as prevention, because police officers were on the street working with communities. But it also, because it was a backing of police officers, had appealed to people who thought Democrats didn't care very much about enforcing the law. We went up to New Hampshire. I was just up there. I understand the Arkansas Travelers were up not too long ago to talk to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. I went up there last week and talked to that same group. And then we went to Texas, where we visited a service program in San Antonio. We went to Dallas, talked to then Governor Ann Richards and John Sharp about reinventing government. But I'll just tell you this last story. It's the last trip ever Clinton ever did with us. And we had dinner last night in Dallas before he was flying back to Little Rock with Ross Perot. Now, you talk about an interesting dinner. I was convinced that night that Ross Perot was going to run for president because, as many of you know, Ross Perot is very straight-laced. He wouldn't even allow people who to wear tassels on their shoes when they worked for him. So I didn't think he was going to run to support President Clinton. But he also just hated President Bush. He just hated him because he thought he and his administration had undercut his efforts to bring back prisoners of war and missing in action in Vietnam. So I was convinced he was running for president. In any event, Clinton was flying back to Arkansas. We were actually going to meet for the Mississippi JJ dinner the next night in Jackson, but he was going to come back to Little Rock. I was going back to my hotel, and I was standing out in front of the place where we had dinner, and this is 1991. In 1984, Oldsmobile drives up. This little man peers out and said, "Can I drive you back to your hotel?" And it was Ross Perot. He was driving a 1984 7-year-old car, and he said to me, I got this car when General Motors gave me this car when I got on the board. He said, they wanted to give me a new one every 3 months, but I told him this one was perfectly good. 7 years old with clear plastic seat covers. I guess that's how you get to be a billionaire, huh? In any event, you all know the story of what happened in the campaign and thereon, so I don't have to tell you about that. Let me just tell you a couple of things you may not know. Some of you do know. Skip knows this. But to me, the most important day in the history of the DLC was July 14th, 1987. You know what happened that day? Bill Clinton announced he wasn't going to run for president in 1988 and expressed an interest in being chairman of the DLC. I think that worked out well for both of us. In December of 1990, Clinton and Sam Nunn and Chuck Robb and I had met and agreed that we were going to do this agenda. But it was unclear whether the DLC candidate would be Bill Clinton or Sam Nunn, who was very popular among DLC people. And the agreement was that we'd go around the country over the next 5 months and put together this agenda. But at the beginning of the year, Nunn would have to carry most of the load because Clinton had the 1991 legislative session. But you know how Clinton is. He got everything he wanted done in about 3 or 4 days, so he was raring to go. Nunn led the opposition to the Gulf War. And that caused him so much consternation in Georgia. People, probably mostly Republicans who had always voted for Sam Nunn, but his approval ratings went from about 90 or 95% to 65%. Most politicians love 65%. Nunn, it just broke his heart. And he never wanted to go back into presidential politics. I'll never forget, on Martin Luther King's birthday, that night, I got a call at home from Sam Nunn saying, I'll do everything I've absolutely committed to do, but I don't want to do anything more. I've sort of had it with this politics stuff. So Clinton carried the ball. There was no question he was going to be our candidate, and the rest is history. I've got a few more stories, and I'm happy to talk about them as we get through. But I want to conclude now with the lessons that what we did, I think, portend for the future. I personally believe that our philosophy, the New Democrat philosophy, the animating principle of opportunity for all, the ethic of mutual responsibility, that core value of community, and its emphasis on private sector growth and empowering government to equip people with the tools they need to get ahead. I believe that philosophy, grounded in values like work, family, faith, individual liberty, inclusion, still viable today. Now, ideas are going to be different because times are different. But that basic philosophy, I think, is still sound. So I think there are lessons for both parties. And that's the third reason I wrote this book. What about for our party, for my party, Democrats and progressives? I think there are two things that are critically important that we have to focus on that, frankly, I think we forget about too often. The first is the importance of growing the private economy. You know, many years ago, Paul Tsongas, this was when I worked in the Carter White House, I was deputy advisor to inflation for Carter. We got the inflation rate up higher than the president's positive ratings in the polls, so what do I know? But Paul Tsongas was our committee chairman on the Hill, and he pulled me aside one day and he said, the problem with the Democratic Party is you spend so much time worrying about passing out the golden eggs, you never worry about the health of the goose. And that's the lesson that Bill Clinton really taught America and taught the Democratic Party. And we can't forget it. It's great to talk about inequality, and we should. It's great to talk about government initiatives to create jobs, and we should. But fundamentally, if you don't grow the private economy, you're not going to have the money to deal with any of it. And because you know, if you don't grow the economy, then every time you want to help somebody, you got to take it away from somebody else, and that's not as Governor Tucker will tell you, that's not an easy political prescription. So the first thing, and I think one of the biggest contributions the Clinton presidency made, was to emphasize the point that economic growth is the prerequisite for opportunity for all. The second is Democrats have to be vigilant and constantly focus on reforming government. We're not like the Republicans. We believe in government. We believe in activist government. We believe government is the vehicle through which we help ourselves and each other. But if it's our vehicle, then we're going to make sure it works as effectively as possible. And every time you have a fiasco like the launch of the healthcare website, it undermines people's faith in government, and it makes it less likely that they're going to vote Democratic. So, you know, we had a rule in the Clinton administration that we never talked about new initiatives without also talking about reinventing government. Probably an unwritten rule, but and that was critical because we knew that if we wanted people to be receptive to our new ideas, we had to convince them that we could run the government and they wouldn't be just throwing money down a rat hole. So those are the lessons that I think are really important for the Democrats. Republicans have a few more lessons to learn. The first is they can't let the Tea Party extremists define them. What rallies troops in low turnout primaries or gerrymandered congressional districts repels the critical swing voters in presidential elections. We learned that in the 1980s from the other side. You know, I've always thought the Republicans needed, it's too late now to do it in this cycle, but I've always thought they needed a power center like the DLC just so the people who wanted to win the presidency had, you know, a place to work from in their party, you know, people like governors and the business community, to protect their candidates who wanted to expand the appeal of the party. The second thing Republicans need is they need to stand for things people want to support. They need some ideas, and they haven't offered ideas in a long time. Now they think they can run against President Obama. That may work in low turnout off-year elections, but it's not going to help a new Republican you know, win the White House in 2016. We have some ideas about that anyway. The third thing they need to do is forget about party unity. It's absolutely overrated. A year ago, they shut down the government. That's Republican Party unity. If you have an extreme group in your party that doesn't compromise, and your highest value is party unity, that means you bring the party over to the extreme group. And you just have to forget about it. You know, as I told you before, we were accused by Walter Mondale and all sorts of people, or we were accused of of dividing the party. Walter Mondale led the most unified Democratic Party, if you look at it, the way most political leaders do of anybody. He had every interest group in the party endorsing a year before the election. The only people who didn't endorse him were the American people. We lost 49 states and came within 2,500 votes of losing all 50. So party unity is overrated. The problem for the Republicans isn't that they're not unified, it's they don't get enough votes. And the final thing for the Republicans, and there are many more, but they need to be more inclusive and more tolerant. Believe it or not, if Mitt Romney had won the same percentage of Hispanic votes that George W. Bush won in 2004, he and not Barack Obama would be sitting in the White House right now. But you can't tell an important growing part of the electorate, and they've done it with Hispanics and with women, that we essentially don't want your vote. I cannot, the candidates have got to be bigger than their party. And I really can't believe, with his background and his family's background, that Mitt Romney believed the immigration policy ought to be self-deportation. But that's where he came to after the primaries, and they just got to be more tolerant. We had, in 1992, there was an interesting, the cultural issue that was more front and center was abortion. And President Clinton, as he did with almost everything, had this incredible way of handling that abortion issue. We knew we were going to get the pro-choice vote, and we weren't going to get the hard pro-life vote. But in those days, and I think probably now, about a quarter of the electorate are what I call soft pro-life. They're against abortion most, but not all of the time. And they're the people that we wanted to talk to. And the important thing when you're a party that hasn't done very well in presidential elections is often to remove the obstacles that keep people from even looking at you, because they may agree with you on a lot of stuff, but if they don't look at you, they won't hear it. And abortion was one of those issues for Democrats. So you all remember it was legal, safe, and rare. We were talking to the country, but we were also talking to that 25% of soft pro-life people. And what did they hear? They heard he's on the other side, he's pro-choice, abortion ought to be legal. But he doesn't like abortion because he wants it rare. So maybe we ought to listen to what he says on other issues. And the result was that we ran, compared to Al Gore, for example, in 2000, about 20 points better among that soft pro-life group than Gore, who had exactly the same policy on abortion. The difference for Gore between a tie and a 5-point victory. And the Republicans ought to look at that. They've got to welcome people who are for gay marriage and for other cultural issues. Even if the core of their party doesn't agree, they've got to say, everybody's welcome in this party, and we'll have an argument, we'll have a discussion on these issues. Now, I'm not in the business of advising Republicans, but I do hope they look at what we did. Because as long as the Tea Party extremists dominate the Republican agenda, it's going to reduce the pressure on Democrats to focus on the political center, on issues like growth and reforming government. And America really deserves better than that. I believe our country depends on two strong and competitive parties debating ideas for making our country better and for fighting for the privilege of national leadership. I hope we set an example in how you do that. And I really hope that in 2016, both candidates try to take a look at what we did and offer the country a vision for how he or she is going to take this country forward. I think it's just critical. Thank you all very much. And
We've got some time for a couple of questions. Yes, sir. Ramirez, right at the back here. Let's see here's the microphone coming at you. And by the way, just everybody, just ask your question, no statements. Just ask the question.
My name is Ramirez Beto, class 9 Clinton student, year 2. First of all, thank you for coming and speaking with us. My question to you, sir, is I am looking at a political future here in Arkansas, and I would like to know some advice that you would give me as far as a political future here in Arkansas, because my fear is, even though I may have a lot of good things to say, just because I would have a D by my name, a lot of people will be turned off by it. And my fear is that Arkansas will become an extension of Texas.
Well, I think I'm
That's a
not
good first question there.
Yeah, right. I think I'll not comment on whether Arkansas is an extension of Texas. But don't forget, Texas is going to turn Democratic, too. Look, I don't live in Arkansas. Jim Guy Tucker, Bob Nash, Jerry Jones, a lot of people who live here can give you better advice in the short term than I can. But I think the best thing you can do for a long-term future is figure out what you stand for, articulate it as clearly as possible, be unafraid to challenge the constraints of orthodoxy in either party, talk to people who you don't think want to listen, be bold about it, because this state will change. You know, if it's changed from a Democratic state to a Republican state, it can change again. And I hope you're young enough, I think you're young enough to have a long-term future. But I just don't think there's any political benefit. The other thing I'd tell you, don't listen to political polls. One of the most incredible things about that period, when we were putting together our agenda, we didn't have any money, so we couldn't do any polling. And Clinton and I used to talk about it, and he used to say, we don't need to do any polling. We know what we need to do. I mean, we examined all the old, voting trends and exit polls from previous elections, but we didn't try to figure out what idea would, sell in the short term. And we knew that many of our ideas actually were not going to be popular in the short term, but and this is my rule, if it makes sense, if you can answer that question of, wouldn't it make sense if we did this, then I think you can eventually convince people that it's a good idea. So to me, is be true to yourself is the most important thing you can do for a long-term political future here. Remember that people really do care about what you stand for. It may take a while in this state, but it'll change eventually. It's going to have it has a different population. Jerry Jones and Bob Nash and I are just talking about it, and that population change will accelerate. What looks dim now may look a lot brighter in 4 or 5 years.
Further questions? Yes. Back at the back.
Speech is growing the economy and having the new Democratic Party emerge in a different way than it has in past, which has resulted in some failures. The question is very simply, how are you going to put together the right coalition that sees the issue from both sides in growing the economy and not exacerbating a reactionary behavior on the haves versus the have-nots?
I think that is clearly, obviously, a very important question. I'm old-fashioned, and I believe presidential leadership is really important. I think the president, and you can do this in a campaign as we tried to do in 91 and 92 and then succeeded as President Clinton became president, is you can set a tone, you can offer ideas that are bigger than the candidate itself or himself or herself. And I think That's what you have to do. I mean, to be honest with you, nobody talks about growing the economy now. We talk about elements of it. We talk about jobs programs, and that's fine. I don't have any problem with jobs programs. But look at what President Clinton did. I had a piece. I think sometimes he's a little defensive about how good his record is. And so I did a piece in the Huffington Post in May that talked about that issue. And I said to liberals, if you want to deal with inequality and restore upward mobility, reduce inequality, take a look at the Clinton template, because that was the way to do it. And here's how, if I were running in 2016, or if anybody listens to me, I would suggest.
I bet they'll listen to you.
Huh? Yeah. The first is a growth strategy. Again, it may require different elements, but our growth strategy, as I said, was fiscal discipline wound up with budget surplus, investment in people and technology, including revamping, wild ideas like charter schools, and we did the Communications Act, all sorts of things, but investing in people and technology, and then expanding trade. The only thing all three things had in common is most traditional Democrats opposed all of them, okay? And I once told John Sweeney, he's a wonderful man, former chairman or president of the AFL-CIO, when he was bragging about the turnout of working people and labor union members in 1996, I said, if we hadn't adopted an economic policy that went against everything you opposed, but grew the economy and created jobs, none of your working class people would vote for us. Because before that, they voted for Reagan and Bush. But in any event, so that's the first thing. The second thing is you need targeted programs that look to people who are left behind. Earned income tax credit was the most important. We did welfare reform, which changed the incentives so people would work rather than stay on welfare. The reason the earned income tax credit was so important is it made work more valuable than welfare. I mean, if it's a logical choice and you get more for being on welfare, you're going to be on welfare. But if you do much better because of the earned income tax credit, you'll want to work. We had empowerment zones. We had all those education and higher education reforms, all critically important. And the third thing that I think is really important in a vision for the country is you've got to make sure that the social fabric is strong. And that's why things like AmeriCorps, which said everybody had an obligation to give something back to the country. As I said, we were all at the White House on Friday with President Obama and President Clinton celebrating the 20th anniversary of AmeriCorps. But also things like community policing. Think back to the 1980s. Nobody wanted to live in cities, so how could they be economic centers? Those things are important, but the most important thing is have a clearly articulated growth strategy. Have an upward mobility strategy to complement it, and then I'd say things that make people want to get together rather than pull apart. And I think a presidential candidate who does that kind of a message will be very well received in our country, because people are tired of what we're having now. Yes, sir.
Question up here, yeah. One of our students up there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Fromm, for coming to see us today. My name is Melvin Clayton. I'm a Class 10 student at the Clinton School. And my question is, in regards to the 2014 midterm elections, whose approval ratings do you see mattering more, President Obama's or congressional Republicans? And also, where do you see that, the implications of that with the presidential election in 2016?
Good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've always believed that the most important number in an off-year election, mid-year election, is the president's approval rating, because it sort of tells how people feel about the country. And, you know, right now that hadn't cut for us, and it probably not cutting for us very much in states where we have a lot of vulnerable Democrats, particularly in the Senate. The congressional elections are very different than presidential elections. I mean, think about this. In 2012, Democrats won 1.8 million more votes cumulatively for Congress than the Republicans. 1.8 million more votes, and the Republicans still won whatever, a 20, 30 vote majority. So I personally believe that the chances of winning the House back before the next redistricting are slim, not impossible, but it would take, you know, an earthquake to happen. The other thing about mid-year elections is the Republicans always have better turnout in a mid-year. You know, they have older voters, a lot of our voters young, minority voters don't come out. And so it's a real challenge for candidates like Mark Pryor and Mary Landrieu and others to get the base of the party energized. Now, I think what happens in the mid-year has no relationship to the presidential electorate. I mean, it's really changed over the last decade or decade and a half, because we have a much bigger electorate on, and so much of the Democratic vote is concentrated in big states that have big numbers that show up in a presidential election but don't. I mean, think about the Senate, okay? I'd say there's a constitutional bias toward the Republicans in the Senate, because New York, California each have two senators, so do Wyoming and Idaho. And the problem is there are just too many conservative, basically all white states that are going to, under ordinary circumstances, put Republicans in the Senate. So we're sort of at a disadvantage. And the truth be known, if it hadn't been for the nutcases in the Republican Party that have won nominations in a bunch of states like Colorado last time, and Indiana, and Nevada, and Chris Coons, my dear friend, DLC fellow, was down here with us a few years ago, who's now the senator from Delaware because he ran against the witch. And I could not get anybody in America to talk to Chris Coons when they thought that Mike Castle was going to be the Republican candidate. As soon as the witch won the primary, he's the most popular person. But there are probably 6 or 7 states like that, and that's why we have the Senate now. So the congressional elections, for the moment, are biased against us. But you all are working on the legislature down here. The reason that's so important, legislatures and governors are important because in 2021, they're going to do redistricting. And if we don't have a say in any of these states redistricting, we'll go through another decade before we win the House. And so that's really important. But I don't think it really bears a great relationship to the electorate in a presidential election.
Well, let me say that I know we could go on with questions, but you can ask them individually
Right.
when you sign this book. I would say 2 things. I want to thank the Clinton Foundation, Stephanie, Joy, and others for helping and co-hosting this event. Al, I want to say that again, I'd love for you to come lecture at this Clinton School and teach Politics 101, but I think the Republicans ought to hire you because you gave them some very good advice, and it's based on good experience of what you gave the Democrats in 1992. And thirdly, I would say that we hope we get to see more of your company in 2016.
Right.
Thank you all for coming very much.